The house started making noise when there wasn't anybody else living in it anymore. Not people noise, house noise, the kind that only shows up when everything else goes quiet. The tin on the roof popping at 4 in the afternoon when the sun hit it hardest. The kitchen faucet dripping 2 drops a minute into the porcelain sink. The side gate banging against the latch when the wind off the Cumberland River came up Buchanan Street. Carolyn hadn't noticed any of those noises before. Not because they weren't there, because the house used to have people in it, used to have the TV going in the living room, music coming out the daughter's bedroom, foolish arguments between brother and sister over the bathroom. All of that made a wall around the other noises, and when the wall came down, the other noises started showing up one by one, each one with its own name and address, like they had been waiting their turn the whole time. It was a Tuesday in May when she realized for the first time that the house had emptied out in a way she could not fill back up the way it used to be. Her daughter, Latanya, had moved down to Atlanta back in January to start a graduate program in her field. Before Latanya, her son Jerome had moved up to Memphis 2 years earlier for a job in a logistics company, and her husband Earl, who had taken on a 6-month route hauling freight cross-country out of Dallas, had left in February, sent money every 2 weeks, called when he could find time on the road, but wasn't coming back until August. Carolyn looked at the clock on the living room wall that Tuesday in May. 5 in the evening. She had finished mopping the kitchen floor an hour earlier. She had washed up the dishes from a lunch she had eaten alone. She had folded a blouse. She had put away a shoe. And now there was nothing else needing to be done until dinner for 1-2 hours from then. Carolyn sat down in the armchair by the window that looked out on the street with her hands in her lap. She thought about turning on the TV. She didn't turn it on. She thought about putting on the ceiling fan. She didn't put it on. She stayed listening to the tin on the roof popping. She got up after a few minutes, walked down to the bedroom that had been Latanya's, opened the door. The room was made up the way she had left it that morning. Bed made with the pink coverlet. Bookshelf empty. A plastic flip-flop forgotten in the corner by the door, the kind Latanya used to slip on when she went out to the back porch. Carolyn closed the door without going in. She came back to the living room, sat down again, looked at her hands. There was a callus on the thumb of her right hand, the kind of callus that only forms on a woman who has held a needle in her hand for a long stretch of her life. It had been 23 years since she had stopped quilting. Her name was Carolyn. Carolyn May Davis, 58 years old, but everybody on the block just called her Miss Carolyn. She had lived her whole grown life in the same house, on the north side of Nashville, on Buchanan Street in the Bordeaux neighborhood, a small 2-bedroom shotgun house with a front porch and a small backyard, with a pecan tree that gave more shade than nuts. The house was Earl's, bought back in 1992 with the money he had saved up from his old job at the Bordeaux paper plant. It was a simple house, with old hardwood floors, gone darker in the middle from the years of walking. Walls painted that pale green that started chipping in the corners, a ceiling fan in the bedroom that knocked when it got tired. Carolyn had been a quilter up until she was 35. She made baby quilts, anniversary quilts, prayer quilts for women who had lost somebody. She sold them sometimes at the Nashville Farmers Market on Saturdays, at a little folding table she would set up with her neighbor Miss Perline back then. She had her customers. She had her respect. And then the second child came. And then a niece needed looking after. And then a sick mama. And then a kitchen to run by herself. And then time came in. And when she looked up, it had been 23 years since she had picked up a needle for anything other than sewing on a button. The piece her grandmother Lula had left her had been put away all that time in the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser, wrapped in a piece of muslin, inside a Whitman's chocolate box that had stopped having chocolates in it long before Carolyn had ever opened it. It was an unfinished quilt block, Sunflower pattern, traditional Tennessee style, hand-pieced on cotton in colors her grandmother had picked herself in 1970 from a scrap basket. Lula had appliqued 2.5 petals of one sunflower, the first petal, the second, part of the third, and then she had passed in 1982 on a January morning at the house off Jefferson Street. The block was left unfinished. The sunflower was left with 2.5 petals. Carolyn had kept it. If you're here today, listening to this story, it's because you know a woman like Carolyn too. Or maybe that woman is you. This space was made for the woman who raised children, kept a house, held the line for decades, and who one day finds herself in a kitchen where there isn't anybody left to cook for. If you haven't tapped that subscribe button yet, stay with me a little longer. This woman still has plenty to say. The months that followed that Tuesday in May were months Carolyn couldn't quite explain to anybody. She got up early, like always. She made her coffee. She drank it alone at the table, looking out at the pecan tree in the back. She washed the cup. She washed the dish from the night before, even though she had already washed it after supper. She mopped the living room floor, which didn't need it. She dusted the shelf, which didn't have dust. She folded the throw blanket that was already folded. She got up out of the chair to do something, forgot halfway through what she was going to do, came back to the chair, sat down, stayed there. By late afternoon, she would walk out to the front porch to look at the street. She would speak to the neighbor next door who was coming home from work. She would come back inside. She would wait for the phone to ring. Jerome called Mondays, Latanya called Wednesdays. Earl called Fridays from wherever the freight had taken him, with that tired voice a man has after 10 hours behind the wheel. It was a 5-minute conversation. They talked about the weather, talked about his cousin's grandbaby starting kindergarten. He asked if she was all right. Carolyn said she was. She always said she was. She had stopped knowing what the opposite of that even meant to say out loud. At night, she would turn on the TV just to have some noise. She wasn't watching. She left the TV on so the house would feel like it had people in it. It was a trick she had picked up without meaning to after about 2 weeks, and that had turned into a habit. The house needed noise. Any noise. Even noise about things that had nothing to do with her own life. One night in June, after a heavy rain came through the bedroom window and got the bottom of the curtain wet, Carolyn went to the closet for a towel to wipe it up. She opened the door. She had to bend down to reach the bottom drawer. When she bent down, she saw at the back the Whitman's chocolate box. She had forgotten she had put it there. She sat down on the floor with the box in her lap. She opened it. She lifted out the piece of muslin. She unwrapped the unfinished quilt block. The sunflower with 2.5 petals was still there. It had been waiting 43 years. Carolyn ran her finger along the edge of the petal. The cotton was soft in a way new cotton is not. It had a light smell of mildew, but not gone bad. It was the smell of an old thing kept with care. She sat there looking at the unfinished block for a stretch of time she couldn't measure. She didn't cry, but she slept that night with the block folded on her nightstand. The next Saturday, Carolyn went to the Nashville farmers market. Not to buy, just to look. She hadn't been in too long. She walked between the stalls. The smell of fresh herbs, the smell of stone ground grits, the smell of hot fried catfish on the back end. She stopped in front of a booth where a younger woman was selling colored thread, needles, plastic embroidery hoops. Carolyn looked at the threads. Yellow, orange, white, green. She didn't buy anything that day. She went home. She ate a piece of bread with cheese. She sat in the armchair in the living room. She picked up her grandmother Lula's block. She stayed there with it in her hands. The next week, she went back to the market. She bought 3 spools of cotton thread, a quilting needle, and a small wooden hoop. She brought it home. She set it on the kitchen table. She didn't use it. She left it on the table for 6 days. On the 7th day, on a Sunday morning, after the weekly call with Latanya, Carolyn sat down in the armchair in the living room, the hoop in her lap, the block stretched out, the yellow thread through the needle. She started stitching the third petal of the sunflower. Her hand shook at first. She remembered how you held the fabric. She remembered how you pulled the thread. She remembered without anybody teaching her again. Her body knew. It had forgotten knowing, but it knew. She stitched for 2 hours straight. When she finished the petal, she stopped. She looked at what she had done. It wasn't perfect. There was a skipped stitch in the corner, but it was quilted. Her hand had done it. It was on a Wednesday in July at the Buchanan Street corner store where Carolyn went to pick up bread in the mornings that she ran into Miss Pearline again after a long while. Miss Pearline was 75 years old, lived 3 houses up from Carolyn on the same street in Bordeaux, had been a widow for 11 years. She had been a quilter her whole life. It was with Miss Pearline that Carolyn had learned her first quilting stitch when she was 12 years old, in the backyard of her mama's house, sitting on a wooden stool under the dogwood tree. The two of them had been neighbors their whole lives, but it had been about 8 years since they barely spoke proper, on account of a foolish disagreement between Carolyn's husband and Miss Pearline's oldest son about a borrowed lawnmower that ended up in a shouting match. Neither Carolyn nor Miss Pearline could remember the real reason for now. Miss Pearline was in line at the corner store with her grocery bag on her arm, buying 2 biscuits and a coffee to take home. When Carolyn walked in, the two of them saw each other. Carolyn spoke, not knowing if she would be answered. Miss Pearline looked at her for a second. Then, without saying a word about the old falling out, without apologizing, without asking for an apology, she said only, "Well, good Lord, Miss Carolyn, it sure has been a minute." Carolyn answered, "It sure has." Miss Pearline asked after Latanya, asked after Jerome. Carolyn told her in a few words. Miss Pearline listened, nodded her head, and as she was walking out of the corner store with her little sack of biscuits, she turned to Carolyn and said, with that calm voice of hers that hadn't changed in all those years, "There's houses that go empty, baby, and there's houses that still got room for something else." That was it. She didn't explain. She walked off slow toward her own house, the little sack swinging on her arm. Carolyn stayed there, in the corner store with her own bread still in her hand. The words stayed with her on the walk back home. They stayed when she passed the empty lot on the corner. They stayed when she said hello to the man at the newspaper kiosk. They stayed when she put the key in her front door. When she came inside, she sat down in the armchair, the bread bag still in her lap. There's houses that still got room for something else. She wondered which one of those two her house was. She went to the kitchen. She warmed up the coffee left over from the morning. She forgot the sugar. She drank it black. She didn't notice until the 3rd sip. She came back to the living room, picked up her grandmother's block that was still on the side table, carried it to the armchair. She didn't quilt that afternoon. She just sat there with the block in her lap, looking at the edge of the sunflower, the 3rd petal she had stitched on Sunday. Miss Pearline's words knocking around in her head like a kitchen faucet drip. The days that followed, Carolyn couldn't go back to being who she was. Before that Tuesday, the house had started making noise. Without meaning to, she started noticing things she had stopped noticing. She noticed that the neighbor 2 houses down, a younger woman in her early 30s named Dominique, who had just had her 2nd baby, had paid somebody to make a hand-quilted baby blanket, and that the blanket had cost her plenty because it was hard to find anybody still hand-quilting in Nashville. She noticed that there was a booth of Tennessee quilts at the farmer's market that was selling for more than she had ever charged in any year of her life. She noticed that her church had ordered 3 lap quilts for the older deaconesses and had paid a woman from Murfreesboro to make them. Before, she walked past those things without seeing them. Now they called out to her, one by one, like signs that had always been there, and she had been walking around with her eyes closed. It wasn't a sweet discovery. It was a kind of shame that took her a while to put a name to. It was the very specific feeling of having had a gift, of having stopped using the gift because there were folks to look after and bills to stretch, and of arriving at 58 with the gift intact, forgotten in the bottom drawer of the dresser inside a chocolate box. One Wednesday in August, Carolyn made up her mind about something she hadn't talked over with anybody. She walked up to Miss Perlin's front door and knocked. Miss Perlin opened up. She invited her in. She sat Carolyn down at the table in the small kitchen with a worn linoleum floor and a standing fan in the corner. She put on water for some coffee. She didn't ask Carolyn why she had come. She waited. Carolyn talked. She talked about finding her grandmother Lula's block in the drawer. She talked about stitching the third petal of the sunflower. She talked about having thought, without meaning to, about what Miss Perlin had said at the corner store. And she asked her if Miss Perlin thought she could still quilt. Miss Perlin gave a soft little laugh. She said she wasn't going to ask whether Carolyn could. She asked Carolyn to bring the block, bring it to the kitchen on Friday morning. Carolyn went. She brought it. She carried it over. That Friday morning, the two of them sat at the kitchen table with natural light coming through the window over the back porch. The fan turned off because the wind off the river had cooled the air early. Miss Perlin studied the block. She ran her hand along the edge. She looked at the sunflower with the 2.5 petals from Grandmother Lula and the third petal Carolyn had stitched. Miss Perlin didn't say whether it was good or whether it was bad. She just said, "You'll need to do about 3 more flowers, baby, to make a proper block." And she said it was about time to pick it back up. It wasn't just that, it was also that. Miss Perlin opened the cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, pulled out a piece of cotton folded in 4, showed it to Carolyn. It was a wall hanging Miss Perlin had started on 3 months ago for a customer over in East Nashville, and hadn't finished because her eyes had been giving her trouble and she couldn't keep up on her own anymore. She asked Carolyn for the help. She said she would split the payment in half. From that Friday on, Carolyn started walking up to Miss Perlin's every morning. The two of them quilted together at the kitchen table with 1 pot of coffee a day, with the conversations women of quilting tend to have about who got married, who passed, who had a baby, who lost a job. Miss Perlin taught Carolyn stitches she had forgotten. Carolyn brought back stitches Miss Perlin didn't use anymore, and on a September morning at the corner store again, Carolyn ran into Dominique, the neighbor mama of the new baby. Dominique asked Carolyn if she knew where to find anybody to make a baptismal blanket by hand for the second child. Carolyn answered her that she did it herself. Dominique didn't know what to say in the moment. Then she asked Carolyn to come by Wednesday to talk it over. There's women who find out the house didn't all empty out. It just made room for things they had forgotten they knew how to do. From that conversation on, the orders started coming. A baby blanket for Dominique, a lap quilt for a 50th wedding anniversary couple up the street, a wall hanging for a restaurant downtown by the Ryman. Carolyn priced fair, not too low, not too high. Miss Perlin guided her. Carolyn listened. And one Wednesday in October, without much fanfare, Carolyn asked Miss Perlin, with a shyness she herself found odd to be feeling, whether she could open a little circle in her own living room every Wednesday afternoon to teach quilting to women on the block who wanted to learn. Miss Perlin thought it was a good thing. The first Wednesday, it was 2 women, Dominique, who had asked about the baby blanket, and a co-worker of Dominique from her nursing assistant job who had dropped her child at daycare and wanted to learn. They sat in Carolyn's living room, the hoop in their laps, the needle in their hand, the TV off for the first time in months. The house made that good sound an old house makes when there are women talking inside of it. Carolyn taught them the running stitch. Dominique messed up 3 times. The other co-worker messed up twice. They laughed out loud. The week after that, there were 3. The third week, there were 5. By the 5th week, the living room could not hold them all, and Miss Perlin offered to lend her front porch on alternating Wednesdays. Earl came home from the road early in August, before his 6 months were up, because the freight contract had ended sooner. When he walked in the house, he stood looking at the living room table, where there was a basket with a hoop, colored thread, a half-finished block. He didn't say anything right off. He sat down in the armchair, waited for Carolyn to come from the kitchen with a coffee. When Carolyn came, she sat in the chair across. Earl looked at her, then looked at the basket, then looked at her again. He said only, "That's pretty, Miss Carolyn." She answered, with the voice that had changed a little without her realizing the exact hour it had changed, that she had stitched 3 flowers now, and that there were still 2 more to do to finish her grandmother's block. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without turning his head, with that voice of his, of a man who had lived plenty and never quite knew how to say what he was feeling, that he had missed her something fierce these 6 months, but that when he walked through the door just then, he had felt something else he hadn't been able to name right away. Carolyn asked what. Earl said after a moment that he had felt the house had stayed alive, that he had pictured on the road that he would come home and find the house still, him and her still, the time of Nashville just running on without anything new inside of it, and that was not what he had found. Carolyn didn't answer. She picked up the block from the top of the basket. She showed Earl the 4th sunflower she had finished 3 days before. Earl ran his hand along the border with the same reverence he used when he was holding a newborn baby. He didn't say any more. He went to the bedroom to unpack. Almost a year after that first Saturday, Carolyn had gone back to buy thread at the farmer's market. She was quilting a christening blanket for a distant cousin of Dominique's, sitting in her living room on a Tuesday morning. The doorbell rang. It was a woman she didn't know. About 45, hair pulled back in a low bun, simple cotton dress, grocery bag on her arm. She said she was a friend of Dominique's cousin, that she had heard about Carolyn's quilting and that she wanted to know if Carolyn could make a quilt for her youngest daughter's wedding, which was going to be in January. The woman's name was Phyllis, retired administrative assistant, 52 years old, 3 daughters, all married, all living far away. Her youngest daughter, who was getting married in January up in Knoxville, was the last one who had moved out of the house 7 months ago. Phyllis talked about the quilt, asked about the price, asked about the timeline. Carolyn answered everything, wrote down the measurements and the colors. When Phyllis was already at the door, on her way out, Carolyn asked her, with the calm she had learned to use over these last months, if Phyllis wanted to stay for a cup of coffee before she headed out. Phyllis stayed. She sat in the armchair in the living room. Carolyn brought the coffee in a small pot with 2 cups. They talked about the weather, about Phyllis's daughter who was getting married, about the trip up to Knoxville. And after a while, Carolyn asked Phyllis, no walking around it, because she felt that woman deserved a direct question, whether Phyllis had felt the house make noise since her youngest girl moved out. Phyllis looked at her for 3 seconds without answering. Then she said with her voice lower that she had, that she wasn't sleeping right, that she was cleaning a house that wasn't getting dirty, that she had started leaving the TV on without watching, that she was scared of staying like that the rest of her life. Carolyn didn't give her advice. She talked about Miss Pearline. She talked about her grandmother Lula's block. She talked about the 3rd petal of the sunflower. She talked about the words. She told Phyllis there were houses that went empty and houses that still had room for something else, but that room was something she was going to have to start finding for it herself. She talked about the Wednesday quilting circle. She said it was free to come for Phyllis to come and see. Phyllis listened in silence. She wrote down Miss Pearline's name on a slip of paper Carolyn tore out of her appointment book. She thanked her. She left. Carolyn stayed in the living room, the basket on her lap, the block from her grandmother in her hands. There was only 1 flower left now to finish the border, the last petal that would close the edge around the 4 corners. Carolyn picked up the yellow thread, ran it through the needle, started. There's women who inherit a quilt block half finished. And there's women who find out an inheritance is not a thing to keep. It's a thing to finish. If you made it all the way here listening to this story, I want to ask you one thing. Comment down below day 1 and tell me what you're going to do today just for you. It can be small. It can be picking up a needle. It can be calling a neighbor you haven't spoken to in a long time. It can be walking into an empty room and finding out what it can still become. I want to read every comment that comes through. Every single one, no exceptions. And if this story made you think of some woman, send her this video, your sister, your friend from work, your neighbor next door. The woman who looked at her house these days and felt like it had gotten too big for just one person. Send it to her. She'll understand why. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, stay with us a little longer. This is a space made for the woman who has lived, who is still living, who is tired of trying to do it all right by herself. Hit that little bell so you don't miss the next videos. And take care of yourself, baby. We'll see each other in the next story.